Human civilization has done an abundance of things to influence most species on the planet. The aves, who are some of the most popular among human-occupied spaces, are no exception to this influence. In fact, they are some of the most affected groups existing in the wild. In some ways, all birds have been affected by humans, but some far more than others. A prime example is with pigeons. Pigeons belong to the family Columbidae. They are small, robust birds, possessing a small bill and head. They can be found in many colors. However, they are mostly variations of white, gray, and brown. They have long wings with incredible muscle control, allowing them to achieve flight abruptly. Pigeons also have really good senses of internal direction. This last fact is what made them a prime candidate for various uses by humans. This is Arwen. She is an oriental roller pigeon. She's one of mine. Very nice. And she will be joining us today. Now, these are one of the domestic breeds of pigeon that originally stem from rock pigeons, which you'll see in the wild quite frequently, especially around large groupings in the cities. Roller pigeons are actually among the larger breeds of domestic pigeon. When you look at other fancy pigeons, such as homing pigeons, they're only about half the size. Now, Arwen here, she is mated to another oriental roller pigeon. His name is Ivos. And the fun thing about pigeons is they're actually monogamous. They will mate for life. And they are very affectionate to their bonded pair. So, you can see the two cuddling and preening each other all the time. Pigeon domestication actually dates back to around 5,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia. Originally, they were domesticated as a food source, just like chickens were. Although people started to notice that these little guys had a very terrific sense of internal direction, so they became messenger birds. And they stayed messaging birds for years and years and years, all the way until quite recently, actually. And they hit their peak as messaging birds during the First World War. Now this here is Cabbage, and he's a domestic homing pigeon. Now if you look at his size, he's actually quite a bit smaller than Arwen was. These guys actually have some very important history behind them in the World Wars. Cabbage here, he's not trained to home, he's just a pet to us, but his ancestors were likely trained and used in the World Wars. In the First World War alone, it's estimated that around 500,000 pigeons served alongside soldiers. Because communication at the time wasn't very good, pigeons were utilized to send messages back and forth, quickly updating people between what's going on in different places. Pigeons were kept everywhere during the wars. They were kept on airships, in naval boats, in traveling troops. They were very kept. There are even a few pigeons throughout history that have received medals from the government and military for their service.
Jeremy was a carrier pigeon that served in the United States military in 1918. He was one of 600 pigeons sent to serve in France, and served 12 successful missions. His most important came in 1918 during the Meuse-Argonne offense. The 77th American Division was cut off from the rest of its group and under heavy fire. Jeremy was sent out with the troops' location, but was shot down by German soldiers. Bravely, he got back up and delivered the message. Cher ended up losing a leg, but was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French government. Pigeons were held in high regard for their contribution to the wars, but favor did not shine on them forever.
As forms of communication advanced, there was less and less need for messaging birds. Eventually, all homing pigeon aviaries shut down and were released back into the wild populations. The once beloved birds were now tossed back into the wild. Now the thing about domestication is that it removes the necessary survival instincts in any animal. These pigeons, that were used to having all their food and water provided for them, now had to hunt in the wild. They struggled to live away from human populations, so they stuck close. In today's age, nearly 7 decades later, pigeons still struggle on their own. Seen as pests by most, pigeons can be found in large numbers, especially in cityscapes. These creatures still instinctually rely on humans for survival, yet people have grown to disdain them. The story of pigeons is a rather sad one of abandonment. A special adaptation was taken advantage of, but when it was no longer convenient, they were tossed out. Of course, not all of these birds were released into the wild. Many pigeons are still kept as pets, like Arwen and Cabbage. Some even continue to be used as messengers. Another common trait in humans is their willingness to keep any and every kind of bird as a pet.
This is Beatrix. She is an Indian blue peahen. A lot of people recognize peafowl by the male's bright colors and long tail, but what many do not recognize is that the females are more muted in color. On her neck, here, you can see that she has a bit of green coloring, but the rest of her body is brown. Just like with peacocks, peahens also have a crest of feathers on their head and white around their face, but that is where the majority of similarities end.
When males and females have different physical characteristics, it's called sexual dimorphism, which is something you'll see a lot in birds. Avians have a special take on this, where the males are incredibly flamboyant, whereas the females are muted. These bright colors are to help attract a mate, which is something you will see in other classes, but birds take it to an extreme. Sometimes they even risk their own survival in the process. Charles Darwin had struggled to explain why, in his theory of evolution, birds kept evolving impractical traits. Before getting to birds, he thought that animals would only evolve traits that would help them to survive, like active camouflage. Eventually, he came up with a reason and label behind it. He called it sexual selection and claimed that if a trait could help with reproduction, it would persist no matter how impractical it was. Peacocks are a very good example of sexual selection, with their long and lavish tail feathers with the sole goal of attracting a mate. But having brighter colors does, of course, mean that more attention is drawn to the individual, which is very unfortunate if you are a bird who is low on the food chain. This does pose the question of why you would evolve this way in the first place, and the answer is actually very simple. When the female sees the long tail feathers, she is able to tell at a glance whether the male is a healthy specimen. To maintain their tail feathers, they have to devote much time to preening and have a consistent diet. In the end, the benefit of reproduction greatly outweighs the very likely possibility of getting eaten. Sexual selection is prominent in birds, especially tropical birds. Often, it reaches the point of impracticality. But there are times when impracticality comes from specializing too deeply. Most are familiar with the common loon, especially Canadians, who have the bird featured on their $1 coin. They are a sleek bird with pointy bills and a haunting call. But what many may not know about them is their advantageous feat. You see, loons spend almost their entire lives on the water. They are adapted to eat in the water, to hunt in the water, and even sleep in the water. Their bodies are also especially designed to take off and land within the water. But this adaptation does not come without its drawbacks. The placement of this bird's lower limbs are as far back on its body as it possibly can be, which is incredibly efficient for swimming, but terrible for walking on land. Loons do not walk so much as they inch themselves forward with their flimsy little feet. This, of course, makes them incredibly vulnerable while they're on land. What works so well for swimming ends up being one of the major disadvantages. But not all specialization comes with this much major disadvantage. Take owls, for example. As a bird of prey, they are especially adapted for hunting. Owls specifically are adapted for night hunting. They have some of the most flexible vertebrae from any species on the entire planet. This adaptation stems from their eyes. The eye itself is more like a tube shape, almost bulging out of the skull. This trait was evolved to allow the owl to see in darker light conditions. Because of its shape, it is needed to be held in place by a bone-like structure. Because bone is more rigid than muscle, owls are unable to move their eye at all. Besides the size and shape of their eyes, owls also sport more rods in their eyes than cones. Now, rods are what enable us to process light and shadow, whereas cones are what allow us to process color. Because of the abundance of rods, owls are able to perceive more light. This again helps them in night hunting. To compensate for their inability to move their eyes, owls have an incredibly flexible neck. They are able to turn their heads 170 degrees in any which direction. Owls as well do not have to deal with the shakiness that comes from being able to move their eyes, and are able to lock onto prey more easily.